Hi everyone, this is Jim. I wanted to show you another game played by Jan Christoph Duda at the Dortmund tournament. As I mentioned, he had a strong start at this tournament, and so this is one of the early games. Duda has the white pieces, and his opponent is Duda-Wojtaszek, another Polish player. So possibly, well, I know I looked it up. They've played each other several times before. So anyway, Duda starts here with d4. Wojtaszek goes knight f6, and now Duda springs bishop to g5, the Trompowsky opening. It's not something you see so often these days, so it's interesting. This young player, new to the scene, is playing in this interesting fashion. Wojtaszek goes with d5 here. The most common move is knight e4. You know, just putting the question to the bishop. What does it want to do there? Normally, the bishop drops back to f4, and then black can continue with either c5 or d5. Actually, c5 is the most popular way to play. d5 is the way that I usually play. I find it a little bit simpler and seems to be pretty solid for black. But anyway, Wojtaszek is avoiding those main lines and allowing, after d5, allowing his knight to be taken and his pawns to be damaged over here. Now, you don't have to take if you're playing a Trompowsky. It actually is a line to play e3 here. But it's kind of the most logical move. I mean, why are you putting this bishop out here if not to cause this kind of pawn damage? So it's kind of the thematic move to go ahead and give up the bishop for the knight and inflict a little bit of pawn damage here. The most popular response is to take with the e-pawn. And black will have a very solid king side with these 4 pawns. But he'll only have 1 pawn in the center. And then he will have the bishop pair with open lines in the center. So pluses and minuses for black's position, but I mean, that is fine for black. Wojtaszek plays in a more interesting fashion by taking with the g-pawn. So he's taking on some weaknesses on the king side here, but in exchange he will get more influence in the center potentially. So a very interesting play from both players. Duda here acts to counter this center influence, or this potential center influence of black may be gathering, by playing c4 directly, just trying to undermine the center. And the chess engine is not entirely approving of this move. In fact, at first it starts to give black a big advantage here, although as you follow down the various paths that the chess engine looks at, it seems that white is okay in every line. So you might think of this as just a way that white is kind of giving equal chances. There's equal chances to both sides in this position, but white gets an interesting kind of offbeat position that maybe he's more familiar with than his opponent. So anyway, I think there's nothing wrong with this move, and it's kind of interesting. Black goes ahead and takes right away. Duda plays with e3, and black plays c5. So he doesn't bother to defend the pawn. He doesn't want to waste a move trying to hold on to that pawn. He just wants to get on with his development. So it's interesting that white doesn't grab the pawn right away, but plays d5. And we're out of the opening book at this point. Black still decides not to defend the pawn, but just continue developing. He's going to castle kingside and maybe try and turn this bishop into a good piece on this diagonal. So let's see how that works out. And white does finally take the pawn back at this point. So it's not a gambit, but it's an interesting structure. Black can push his pawns on the queen side, maybe gain some space over here. It's also an idea to push the f-pawn forward and open up lines for his bishop. Black has the bishop pair, but he also has a weakened king side, and white is going to hope to exploit that. White is going to develop his knights and start to bring them over to the king side. So anyway, Wojtaszek starts off his plans with f5, getting the pawn out of the way of the bishop, threatening to take on b2 there. White blocks with knight to c3. Now this knight develops, knight d7, we get knight e2, so some typical development here. You might think this is a little bit funny, but he wants to bring the knight to the g3 square and put pressure on that f5 pawn. Also, while the knight is here, it's preventing that pawn from marching forward. So maybe a couple ideas for that knight. So a6, preparing some queenside advances, and a4. to slow down the queenside advances. Knight to e5, kicking the bishop. Bishop drops back. And then both sides castle. Black castles, white castles. So black is not afraid to castle into this weakened structure over there. Here, over on his king side, he does have, a couple of pieces around. Queen is not too far away. White has this advanced pawn in the center, which is maybe a little bit annoying. It kind of restricts the light squared bishop here. So anyway, interesting position with possibilities for both sides. So rook to b8. Black is still intent on pushing his pawns forward over here. Now knight to g3, starting to pressure the f5 pawn. b5. So we get this exchange, and black did succeed in gaining space over here on the queen side. And now queen to c2. So the queen and the knight are coordinating on the f-pawn, and black plays a move, queen d6, that does not seem to address the threat, at least at first. And so it is possible for white to grab the pawn here. But white doesn't play this, and so you might want to think about this position a little bit. It's black's turn to move. If white had grabbed that pawn, it would be black's turn to move. And he has kind of a tactical response here, which allows him to inflict some damage on white's position. So it doesn't exactly get the pawn back, but gets compensation for the pawn here. So yeah, if you want to pause the video, see if you can figure out what black's idea is here. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. Black can play the interesting move knight to f3 check and just sack that knight in order to open up the g file, so that the queen had just moved to the 6th rank in response to that knight g3 move, or in response to the threat to, I guess it was queen c2 was the last move that really threatened the f-pawn. So this queen can come over here and deliver a check. And so this knight sacrifice is, the knight is recaptured. So black did not get the pawn back, but what black did get is he got this open file, and he got active placement for his pieces here. The queen and the bishops look a bit menacing, though the chess engine rates this position as even. Anyway, Duda didn't want to go for that line. He just played the move knight to e2. So now black pushes on with b4, and there's a very interesting idea coming up here on the queen side. Rook a to c1 is played, and now we see Wojtaszek's idea. He pushes his pawn on to b3. He sacrifices a pawn. He actually gives up 2 pawns and then gets one back. So this is going to be a real pawn sacrifice. White takes. He pushes the c pawn forward. White takes, and now black takes here. And this is a nice little tactical shot. So he got his pawn back, and he gets the rook to the 2nd rank here. So, I'm sure Wojtaszek was thinking that this is going to be great compensation for the pawn and definitely worth playing. And the problem with taking the knight, well, you might want to think for a second that why the queen can't take the knight before I tell you. Okay, I hope you saw this. I'm going to give the answer away now, so pause the video if you want time to think about it. But if the queen takes the knight, then we have knight to f3 check again, and that also unleashes the bishop on the b2 square, so that would lose the queen in exchange for rook and knight. So that's no good. So the queen drops out of the way, queen to d1. This queen comes out to b4. And now there's a fascinating move here played by white. I won't ask you to guess it, because I would never guess it in a million years. He played the move knight to d4. Now, the reason I would never guess it is that this bishop is just hanging, right? He moved the queen here to b4. He's got 2 pieces attacking it and only 1 defending it. And Duda plays this amazing move, knight to d4, just ignoring the threat to the bishop. So at this point, it's definitely worth thinking about the game. What is white's idea if black just takes the bishop? And in fact, black does take the bishop. So the question is, how is white planning to get compensation or get the piece back? And so, yeah, why don't you pause the video and think about this for a while? because I was really surprised when I saw this move, and I thought about it quite a bit myself, and I did come up with an answer, not quite what they came up with in the game, but I did come up with some ideas as to how white is justifying this sacrifice. Okay, I am going to give the answer away now. So black did take that bishop, and the first move of white, I hope you saw this one, is knight to c6. It's a move that comes with tempo. It hits the queen, and it also hits this pawn over here, which can be taken with check. And now the move I was expecting was queen to b5. Just, defending the knight and not getting in any pins. And but when you play that move, you are giving up this pawn with check. So I thought this was the idea. Knight takes here, check. And then, well, the king has to move. Nobody can take the knight. And then I thought the knight was going to play here, and you would have, let's count, 1, 2 versus 5. Yeah, you'd have 3 pawns for the piece, and this would be, I don't know, seemed pretty decent compensation to me. So I thought that was the idea. I looked at this with the chess engine, and it likes my analysis partway. So it likes this knight takes e7, king h8, but here it would actually take the bishop off, and then grab the f-pawn with the other knight. And I guess this is even more interesting. White has gotten rid of the bishop pair advantage. He has 3 pawns for the piece. And, black's king position is maybe a little bit insecure. With the knight here, there's potential back rank problems. Now, the knight is not really pinned, since this knight can drop back and defend his rook. So there's no pin operating here. You just have to play this position with the pawns versus the piece. The chess engine rates that as about even. So that was definitely one way that it could be played. Here, let's go back to the game. After knight c6, oh, there was one other idea here. Knight c6 was played. In addition to queen b5, the move I thought of, there's also this move, knight takes e3, kind of a counterattacking move, where 2 queens are hanging. and if you take the queen, let's see, knight takes b4, knight takes d1. I think this works out pretty good for black. Let's see, this knight can go to d3. How's this going? Let me think about this. That was white's choice to take the queen. Seems like black gets out of this all right with rook to b5. Just dropping the rook back, and then white captures this piece, and black captures this pawn here. And if we pause to count the pieces here, we see pieces are even, but black does have the bishop pair, and black has an extra pawn. Yeah, so this line is good for black. The other possibility after knight takes e3, though, is instead of taking the queen, you take the knight, and then the queen runs away to a3, and this queen comes out to f3, and this seems to be about even. So both those lines that I showed you, the previous one with queen to b5, and this one with knight takes e3, both turn out to be about even. So I guess this is all playable, no matter what black does after this knight c6 move. It seems like white is going to have enough compensation for the piece, or he will get the piece back. So Wojtaszek didn't choose either of those moves. He didn't play queen b4, and he didn't play knight takes e3. He played queen to c5, which keeps an eye on this pawn, so that this knight e7 check idea is not there, but it gives the knight back. And so, in fact, after this, white is better, because when white recaptures the knight, he's left with an advantage here. So Duda continues with queen to a4, and now and black continues with rook to d2, keeping the rook on the second rank and looking to target the center pawn here. So I think he's just hoping to give the piece back, grab the pawn, and think of this as more or less an equal position. with where he still has the bishop pair in exchange for some king weaknesses. It just doesn't quite work out for him. The chess engine is already saying that white is better here and that black needs to think about defense and retreat his rook to b7. So anyway, we'll see why black's ideas don't work out. It's because after rook d2, first there is rook takes c4, which comes with tempo, hitting the queen. The queen still doesn't want to give up the e7 square, so the queen drops back, the e7 pawn, and so the queen drops back here to d6, and now this queen comes into a7, and this is the problem. White is really starting to coordinate against black's defenses on the 7th rank, and white is coordinating against black's defenses on the 2nd rank, and black doesn't get enough counterplay here. Let's see. He tried to move bishop to f6. Yeah, the other bishop. Cancel that. Sorry about that. Bishop to f6. So defending the pawn. And now white goes with knight to h5, just going after that bishop. Even stronger here, actually, and this is a move I thought was kind of interesting, and I was wondering if it could be played, so I was checking it out with the chess engine. e4 is a good move here. The idea is that if he takes, the knight comes back and forks the queen and the bishop, so that'd be pretty annoying. If he doesn't take, he could push on with f4, kicking the knight, but white can push on with e5, forking the queen and the bishop again. And after, say, bishop takes e5, knight to e4, hits the queen, and this is a funny position. It's a fork. The knight is forking the queen and the rook. The queen can take this pawn, hitting the rook. The queen can take that pawn, defending his rook and hitting this rook, but the knight can take here, take that rook, defending this rook, and so basically, white wins the exchange after some complications. So e4 would be a good move there, but Duda just played the move knight to h5, which also keeps a winning edge, it seems. And now, let's see, the king gets out of the way so that maybe this rook can come to the g file, and the bishop doesn't go with check. Takes off the bishop, and the queen stays here to blockade the pawn. Let's see, white plays rook to d4 at this position, so white has managed to defend that center pawn, and black never managed to scoop it up. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I take that back. He played rook to d4 here, defending it this way. And now black is down in material, and plus his kingside pawn structure is even more of a mess than it was before. So he definitely doesn't want to trade anymore. So he tries to stay active with his rook, avoid the trade. Goes rook c2. This knight hops into b4. Rook runs up to c5. Taking a look at this pawn again, although that pawn is well defended once again. Let's see, rook f to d1 was played. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, it's white's turn. Rook f to d1. Yeah, so doubling on the d file. Bishop to d7. We have queen to a6, offering the queen trade. And I guess Wojtaszek didn't find anything better. Also, we're on move 31, and he may be getting into time trouble after that complicated middle game sequence that we just saw. So he goes for the trade, but this leaves him in pretty much a lost position. Let's see, he continues with rook to b5. h4 was played. Rook to c8. The other rook comes over to c8. Knight to b4. King to g7, so getting his king out and getting his rooks active. King to h2, getting king off the back rank. King to f8. Rook 1 to d2, so controlling the second rank here, so that this rook can't penetrate if the knight moves away. This rook goes to the b file, the knight goes to d3. Yeah, some ideas for maneuvering the knight around. King goes to e7. Knight goes here to f4, where it's blockading those tripled pawns. And let's see, rook to b2. Black does get to the second rank again. He pushes on with d6, d6 check. King drops back to f8. And now he plays knight to h5. And we've hit the time control. We made move 40. But at this point, there is no defense to knight takes f6. And, white is just going to be a couple pawns up, and it's a winning endgame. So black resigned at this point. Anyway, a nice game by Duda, and also a good tournament performance. I mentioned in the previous video this was his first top-level international tournament. I mean, he's played in other big tournaments. He's played in things like the Gibraltar Open and the Qatar Masters, but those are tournaments that have 100 or so players. This is one of those elite tournaments with where players are invited. So there was only 8 players in this tournament, and it means that every opponent you face is going to be really strong. And he started out, like I said, really well. He scored 2.5 out of 3 in the first 3 games. Then he lost to Kramnik, and that was the game I showed previously. And then he finished the tournament with some draws. So he ended up in second place. So anyway, a good showing for a new player on the top-level tournament scene. He's only 20 years old, so maybe somebody you will hear about again in the future. And the winner of the tournament was actually Ion Nepomniachtchi. In second place, there was Duda, along with Giri and one other player I can't think of at the moment. And then Kramnik, after he won that nice game against Duda, he lost to Nepomniachtchi, and he lost another game. So he finished out of the running. So anyway, the tournament is over, and that's how things finished up. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I should be back to my normal chess videos, the Blitz games and the live commentary starting this Friday. So I will see you then. Bye.